He counted 11 vehicles in the convoy and smiled. That was the number he needed. 11 vehicles, 43 personnel, and a mountain pass that funneled everything into a single line. From his position at the Eastern Observation Post, Colonel Yevgeny Marsh radioed back to his forward command that the northern outpost would be neutralized before nightfall. The men inside had nowhere to go. One road in, one road out, and both were now his. What Marsh did not account for, what no one in his command structure had accounted for, was the woman who had arrived at the outpost 4 days earlier with a hard case, a canvas bag, and a transfer order that listed her specialty as logistics support. The outpost sat at 2,340 meters on a ridge above the Kwadacha corridor, a former fire lookout station that the Canadian Armed Forces had reinforced and repurposed during the Northern Sovereignty operations. It was not a glamorous posting. The heating system ran on a backup generator that had been failing since February. The satellite uplink dropped twice a day in high wind. The nearest support was a 4-hour drive in clear weather, and the weather in the Kwadacha was not clear. Sergeant First Class Adaeze Renner had been station commander for 11 weeks when the logistics transfer arrived. He read the order twice, not because it was complicated, but because it didn't make sense. The outpost had 8 personnel. They were not scheduled for reinforcement. They were, according to the latest divisional memo, scheduled for drawdown. Renner had already begun the paperwork, and yet here was an authorization, signed by someone 4 levels above his direct command, for one Corporal Adaeze Obi to be temporarily assigned to Forward Outpost Kwadacha for purposes of logistical assessment and equipment calibration. When Obi arrived, she came up the access road in a supply truck that was only nominally going her direction. Sitting in the back with her hard case across her knees, she was 29 years old. She had dark eyes, a calm that the other personnel would later describe as unsettling, and an efficiency of movement that suggested she had spent a great deal of time in small spaces where unnecessary motion cost something. Renner met her at the gate. He looked at the case. He looked at her. "Logistics support," he said. "That's what the order says," she said. He let her in. What else was he going to do? She spent the first day doing exactly what her transfer order described. She walked the outpost, cataloged the equipment inventory, noted what was working and what wasn't. She asked questions about the generator, about the fuel reserves, about the sight lines from the eastern wall. The questions about the generator and the fuel reserves made sense. The questions about the sight lines she framed as safety assessments. Renner noticed she was looking northeast when she asked them, which was not the direction from which threats typically arrived in the Kwadacha. Threats, historically, came from the south. He didn't say anything. She was 4 levels above his authority, whatever the order said, and she hadn't done anything wrong. On the second day, she climbed to the roof of the main structure before dawn and stayed there for 2 hours. Renner sent Corporal Hadley up to check on her. Hadley came back down looking thoughtful. "What's she doing?" Renner asked. "Watching," Hadley said. "She's got a spotting scope. She's watching the pass." Renner climbed up himself. Obi was lying flat on the roof with a small carbon fiber tripod supporting a Schmidt and Bender spotting scope, the kind that cost more than Renner's monthly salary. She was making notes in a small book with a mechanical pencil. "Corporal," he said. "Sergeant Renner." She didn't look up. "That's not logistics equipment." "No," she said. "It isn't." He crouched beside her and looked through the scope at the pass below. In the early light, the valley floor was still gray, the tree line dark, the road cutting through both in a long pale line. "What are you seeing?" She turned a page in her notebook and showed him. She had drawn a topographic sketch of the valley from memory, marking elevations, wind corridors, sight angles. There were numbers in the margins that he recognized as angular measurements. There were others he did not recognize. "I'm seeing what's coming," she said, "and I'm measuring whether I can do anything about it." Renner looked at the sketch for a long moment. Then he sat down on the roof and didn't go back inside for an hour. The intelligence had reached divisional command 6 days before Obi's transfer order was cut. A convoy, 11 vehicles, estimated 40 personnel, with 2 heavy weapon systems mounted on the 4th and 9th vehicles in the column, was being staged in the valley below the Kwadacha corridor. The analysis suggested it would move within the week, The outpost, with 8 lightly armed personnel and degraded communications, was directly in its path. Command's official response had been to initiate drawdown procedures. Someone else's response had been to send Obi. She had been in her current designation, which was classified in a way that made Renner realize logistics support was not even a polite fiction, but simply the only category that could hold her paperwork for 4 years. Before that, she had been a competitive shooter representing Ontario in long-range precision events, the kind that happen in farmers' fields outside of small towns and are attended by serious people with notebooks not unlike hers. She had set 2 national records before she turned 24 and had not spoken about them since. The mathematics of long-range shooting, the real mathematics, not the simplified version that was taught in training, was what most people never understood about it. It was not about aim. Aim was the smallest part. It was about environment, temperature, humidity, altitude, the Coriolis effect, wind speed at multiple points along the projectile's path, the spin drift introduced by the barrel's rifling, the aerodynamic jump at the moment of departure. At extreme range, a change of 2 degrees in wind angle at the midpoint of the trajectory could move the point of impact by more than half a meter. Every calculation cascaded into the next. Every variable had to be estimated, held, re-estimated as conditions changed. Obi did this the way other people did arithmetic, continuously, automatically, without apparent effort. What she had been doing on the roof for 2 hours was measuring the valley. On the 3rd day, the convoy began to move. Renner's communications were degraded but not dead. He got word from Divisional Relay at 0540. Convoy confirmed in motion. Estimate 6 hours to Quadacha access. No extraction available. Hold position. He read the message 3 times. Hold position. He had 8 people. He had a failing generator. He had 1 functional communications relay, and a woman on his roof who was not, whatever her transfer order claimed, a logistics specialist. He climbed to the roof. Obi was already there. She had the spotting scope out and was tracking the distant movement in the valley, small dark shapes against the gray, barely visible, but moving with the deliberate spacing of a trained convoy that expected to encounter something. They were keeping 50 meters between vehicles. That was not accidental. They know we're here, Renner said. They've always known, Obi said. The outpost isn't a secret. The question is what they think we can do about it. What can we do about it? She looked up from the scope. In the early light, her expression was not hard, exactly, but it had a steadiness to it that Renner associated with people who had already finished a conversation with themselves and arrived at the conclusion. I need to tell you something, she said, about why I'm here. I've been waiting, he said. She told him. The convoy was the mechanism. Not the target, the mechanism. What it was carrying, in the 4th vehicle, in the long case secured to the internal frame, was a communications array that, once deployed to the valley floor and activated, would interrupt the divisional relay network for this sector for approximately 72 hours. 72 hours in which the outpost and every forward position in the Quadacha would be operating blind. The convoy itself was escort. Protection for a payload that weighed 60 kilograms and had been built specifically for this corridor. If the 4th vehicle reached the valley floor, the rest didn't matter. The damage would already be done. Renner looked down at the valley. The convoy was moving at approximately 40 kilometers per hour. At that rate, they had roughly 5.5 hours. What's the range to the access point? He asked. She was already turning the page in her notebook. 3,400 meters. She said, to the first choke point. He looked at her. There's a second choke point, she said, at 2,800. Better angle. But the wind is different there. I've been running it since yesterday morning. Can you do it? She looked back down at the valley. The convoy was a thin, dark line against the pale ground. I've been doing it in my head for 30 hours, she said. So yes, she spent the next 4 hours on the roof, which was the only place in the outpost that gave her the angle she needed. Hadley came up twice with coffee. She drank it without looking away from the scope. The wind was the problem, not because it was strong, but because it was inconsistent. The Quadacha corridor created a funnel effect that generated unpredictable lateral gusts at the 3-kilometer mark, gusts that would arrive and dissipate in under 4 seconds. To fire through them, she would need to read them before they peaked, calculate the effect at multiple points along the trajectory, and adjust her solution, all in the time it took the gust to form. She had built a model in her notebook. 14 variables, updated every 20 minutes as conditions changed. The model was not beautiful. It was covered in small notations, arrows, erasure marks, numbers crossed out and replaced. It looked like the work of someone trying to catch water. At 13:15, Renner came back to the roof. "They're at the ridge descent," he said. 40 minutes, maybe less. I know. She had already shifted the scope. The convoy was closer now, the shapes resolving into individual vehicles, the spacing between them visible. She found the fourth vehicle and held it. "If this doesn't work," Renner said, "we have nothing." "I know that too. Your authorization, whoever signed that order, they know what they're asking." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They asked me what I needed. I said time and a roof. They gave me 4 days and a helicopter that didn't land." Renner sat down on the roof behind her. That was the most honest summary of a classified operation he had ever heard. "The second phase," she said, not looking up, "is making sure they go home." "Who?" "Your people. The 8 of them. Once the fourth vehicle is stopped, the convoy will halt. They'll try to identify the origin. At 3,400 meters, in this terrain, in these conditions, they'll be looking for 40 minutes before they find the right quadrant. Your people need to be in the lower bunker, with the door sealed in the first 3 minutes." Renner had been told, in his career, a number of things by a number of people with varying degrees of authority. He could count on one hand the times he had been told something that reorganized his understanding of the situation in the space of a single sentence. This was one of those times. She hadn't been calculating whether she could stop the convoy. She had been calculating how to stop it in a way that kept his people safe while she did. He went back down to brief his personnel. He had 3 minutes to make them understand something he himself had only understood 30 seconds ago. At 13:47, the fourth vehicle was 3 kilometers out from the access choke point and moving at 35 kilometers per hour. It would arrive at the choke point in approximately 5 minutes. After that, the terrain opened up and the shot geometry became far more complicated. Obi had been watching a specific tree line for the last 12 minutes. The trees were a stand of lodgepole pine at the 2.8-kilometer mark, and they told her what the wind was doing at that range in a way that no instrument she carried could replicate. When the upper branches moved north, the gusts were coming from the southwest. When they moved east, the source was shifting. For the past 8 minutes, they had been moving north consistently, which meant the gust pattern was holding. She had updated the model 6 minutes ago. She was not going to update it again. The mathematics of what she was about to attempt were not, by themselves, impossible. Long-range records had been set at greater distances. What made this specific problem difficult was the convergence of variables: altitude, temperature inversion in the valley, the moving target, and the gust corridor at the midpoint. Any single variable she could manage. All of them together simultaneously in real time was the thing that most people could not hold in their minds. She was not most people. She had spent 20 years building a mind that could hold it. She settled the stock into her shoulder. She found the fourth vehicle in the scope, the slight additional height of the roof rack where the case was secured, the distinctive antenna cluster at the rear, the spacing that kept it precisely fourth in line. She had been watching it for 40 minutes. She knew which wheels hit which ruts in the road. She knew the interval between the driver's steering corrections. She knew the rhythm of the vehicle in a way she could not have articulated but did not need to. Because she was not going to articulate it, she was going to use it. The gust came at 13:48:3. She fired at 13:48:26. At the front of the convoy, in the lead vehicle, the driver heard something that he would spend the next hour trying to describe accurately. It was not, he said afterward, a sound he associated with incoming fire. It was more like a mechanical failure. A crack and then a cascade, the fourth vehicle losing its axle geometry all at once, slewing left and coming to rest across the road in a way that was definitive and complete. The driver of the fifth vehicle braked hard. So did the third. The convoy accordioned and stopped. The radio erupted. In the next 4 minutes, there were 11 separate attempts to identify the origin of the shot. Personnel dismounted and took up defensive positions facing south, which was the direction from which threats historically arrived in the Kwadacha. 2 vehicles were repositioned to provide cover to the east. One team moved to the tree line on the western side of the road. Nobody looked north. Nobody looked toward the ridge at the 2.8-kilometer mark, where the angle was tight and the wind was wrong, and where a woman in a prone position on a reinforced roof was already recalculating because the convoy had stopped moving, and she needed to confirm the 4th vehicle was not going to be manually towed to a position where it could still function. It was not. The shot had taken the front axle housing at an angle that collapsed the steering linkage, and the case inside was not rated for the kind of lateral force that produced. She could see it through the scope. The array was not going to the valley floor today. She stayed on the roof for another 22 minutes, watching until the convoy commander made a decision she had anticipated. He turned the remaining vehicles around. Not a retreat, a tactical withdrawal to reassess. The distinction mattered to him. It did not matter to her. What mattered to her was that all 8 of Renner's people were in the lower bunker when it happened, and all 8 were still there, and she could hear Renner's voice through the roof hatch asking for a status report. 4th vehicle is stopped, she said. Array is non-functional. Convoy is withdrawing. There was a pause. Then say again. Convoy, she said, is withdrawing. The after-action review took 3 weeks. Obi was present for the first 2 days of it and absent for the remainder, which was not unusual for people of her classification. The review board confirmed what the physical evidence had already established. One shot from a position at 2,840 meters, as calculated by ballistic backtrace, had disabled the primary vehicle in the convoy in a way that rendered the operation non-viable. The board also noted, in a supplementary finding, that the shot had been taken during a 4-second window between gusts, through a vertical angle of elevation that required accounting for both the downslope trajectory and the temperature inversion in the valley, and that the point of impact was within 11 centimeters of the calculated optimal strike point for maximum chassis disruption at minimum risk of explosive secondary effects. The supplementary finding was classified. The main report was not. Renner was called to give a statement. He described the 4 days, the roof, the notebook, the coffee that Hadley brought up. He described the moment she told him about the second phase. He was asked at one point whether he had at any time questioned Corporal Obi's competence or fitness for the assigned task. He thought about the sketch she had shown him on the second day, the topographic map she had drawn from memory with the angular measurements in the margins and the numbers he didn't recognize. No, he said. Not for a moment. He was asked if there was anything he would have done differently. He thought about that for longer. I would have brought her coffee myself, he said, instead of sending Hadley. The thing that stayed with Renner in the years afterward, and there were years afterward, more of them than he had expected that morning when the convoy came over the ridge, was not the shot itself. The shot was extraordinary in a technical sense, the kind of thing that made its way into training discussions and ballistic textbooks, and the occasional documentary that was vague about operational specifics. It deserved to be remembered. But what he remembered, when he was being honest about it, was the 22 minutes she spent on the roof after the shot, watching the convoy withdraw. She could have come down. The threat was neutralized. His people were safe. There was no operational reason to stay in position. She stayed anyway, watching, until she was certain. That was the detail he kept coming back to. Not the calculation. Anyone with enough talent could be taught calculation, or at least that's what he told himself, though he knew it wasn't true, not at that range, not with those variables. What he came back to was the 22 minutes. She had been sent to stop a convoy, she had stopped it, and then she had spent 22 more minutes making sure. That was not calculation. That was something else, something harder to name, and in his experience considerably rarer. He met her once more, 2 years later, at a facility he was not permitted to describe in any detail. She was carrying the same canvas bag. She looked the same calm, the same economy of movement, the same sense of a conversation with herself that had already been finished. She was talking to a group of younger personnel who were holding notebooks and looking at her with an expression he recognized. He had worn that expression himself, on a roof above the Quadacha when she showed him the numbers in the margins. She saw him across the room and gave him a brief nod. He nodded back. He thought about saying something, about the roof, about the coffee, about the 22 minutes. He didn't. Some things didn't require a footnote. The people who needed to understand them already did. The helicopter had lifted on the last day, and she had closed her notebook, and the room below the ridge had been very quiet. It stayed that way.